I felt sick, I felt revulsion, I felt that no one would ever want to know me. My name is Teresa Wyler, and in my early 20s, I sat in a small room in North London and read 4 words that rewrote my entire existence. My biological parents were brother and sister. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly had to. But let me take you back to the beginning, because my story doesn't start in that office. It starts in a children's home in West London with a little girl who didn't exist on paper until she was 2.5 years old.
I was born in West London. My mother was 16, unmarried, and she left very quickly after I arrived. I was taken into the care of what was then called London County Council and moved into a children's home, not like the ones you might picture today. This was a vast place. It had its own school, its own nursery, its own hospital, everything contained within its walls. And somewhere inside those walls was me, a baby, unnamed in any family photograph, unplaced in any family story. My children's worker decided she would try to find me a proper home, and so she placed an advertisement in the Tablet, a Catholic weekly newspaper, asking for a home for a 2.5-year-old girl. She described me as being of above average intelligence and very bright. My parents were looking at the time. They answered the advertisement. I started visiting them in West London, and eventually at 2.5, I was adopted. They already had 2 boys, 2 and 4 years older than me, and they subsequently adopted another little girl after me. So we became a family of 4 children, growing up together. And here is something I want you to understand, because it matters later. My childhood was happy, genuinely happy. Some might even say privileged. My dad was a very senior civil servant. In fact, he was the man who orchestrated the National Remembrance Service for 20 years. We played sport, we played music, I went to a lovely school, I was loved, I was wanted, I slotted into that family as though I had always been there, and for a long time I had absolutely no reason to question any of it. It wasn't until my brothers began to settle down and start their own families that something shifted in me. The first grandchild arrived, my nephew, and I remember feeling this overwhelming, almost physical urge. I wanted that. I wanted marriage, children, a home of my own. It felt completely natural. It felt like the obvious next step. And that want, that simple human want, made me start thinking about something I had never thought about before. My genetics. I didn't know anything about where I came from. I mean, I literally did not exist on paper until I was 2.5 years old. No photographs, no birth stories, nothing. And now I was thinking about having children of my own, and I realized I had no idea what I might be passing on. So without telling anyone, I want to stress that without telling a single soul, because I didn't want to upset my parents or make it seem like there was anything wrong with my upbringing, I contacted social services. They told me my records were held in Islington in North London. They arranged for me to go and view them, still in secret. I told nobody. I took myself to the Islington office one afternoon. The receptionist showed me to a small room, plain walls, a table, a chair. She said they would bring my records in shortly. I wasn't allowed to photocopy anything. I wasn't allowed to take anything away. I could write notes if I wanted to. A few minutes later, she brought in a file. She put it on the table, and she left. I opened it. The first thing I read was that my mother was unmarried, 16 years old, unable to care for me alone. That was why she had left me. That was why I had gone into care. And I remember thinking, all right, 16, alone. I can understand that. It was sad, but I could understand it. And then I carried on reading down the page, and I saw the details of my father. I saw that my father was her brother. He was 14 years old. I stared at it. I read it again. I think I read it 3 or 4 times, because my brain simply would not process what my eyes were seeing. My parents were brother and sister, a 16-year-old girl, and her 14-year-old brother, and I was the result. You have to understand the world I had grown up in. A devout Catholic family, a community where sex before marriage was already frowned upon, already considered shameful, and this was something so far beyond that scale, I didn't even have language for it. I had no framework, I had no context, I had nothing to reach for. The lady came back. She took the file off the table without a word. I said nothing. She said nothing. To this day, I do not know whether she was aware of what was inside. I suspect nowadays there would be counselling before you were handed something like that. A professional sitting with you, a warm voice, some kind of preparation. There was none of that, just a file, a table, and then nothing. I walked out of that office, into the street, and I just walked for a long time. I walked and I walked and I tried to make my mind catch up with what I had just learned. I felt sick, I felt revulsion, I felt shame, so deep and so sudden it was almost physical, like something cold had been poured straight into my chest. And I felt, and this is the part that is hardest to say, I felt like it answered a question I had always carried. Why had nobody wanted me? Why had I started life in a home rather than a family? Now I thought I knew. I thought the answer was in those 4 words. And I made a decision, there and then, on that pavement in North London. I could never tell anyone, not a single person, not ever, because if I did, they would look at me the same way I had just looked at that file, with that same revulsion. And they would not want to keep me either. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no breakdown, just a very quiet, very private dismantling of the life I thought I was going to have. Because while I was walking those streets, processing the unprocessable, I made a second decision, one that would shape the next 20 years of my life. I decided I would not have children. I know how that sounds. Looking back now, I can see how wrong I was, how ill-informed, how completely alone I was in making that choice. But I want you to understand what I knew, or rather what I thought I knew, in those days. Nobody talked about incest. There was no internet. There was no community forum where I could quietly type my situation into a search bar and find out whether my fears were grounded. In fact, there was nothing, just scaremongering and silence and my own terror. And I genuinely believed, I was absolutely convinced that if I had children, there was a very high likelihood I would pass on some kind of developmental delay, mental or physical, that my children might suffer for something that had nothing to do with them. And I could not do that. I could not wish that upon a child of my own. So the path I had imagined for myself, marriage, a home, babies, I quietly folded it up and put it away. And life carried on around me, as though nothing had changed. My siblings had their children, the family grew, grandchildren arrived for my parents, and I became the best aunt I could possibly be. I built ferociously strong relationships with every single one of my nieces and nephews. They were my joy. They still are. And for a long time, that was enough. Or rather, I told myself it was enough. But the secret had teeth, and it was always just below the surface. People would ask, casually, the way people do, "Oh, Teresa, don't you want to get married? Don't you want children?" And I would smile and bat it away. Haven't met the right one yet, not the right time. And they'd nod and move on, and I would carry on smiling. The worst of it was relationships, because I was of the age where most of the men I met wanted what most men want, to settle down, start a family, build something, and I could not explain why that wasn't something I could offer. How could I say I didn't want children when everyone who knew me could see how much I loved them? So instead of explaining, I would pull away. The moment something started to become serious, I would end it. No explanation, just distance, just withdrawal. People didn't understand. I couldn't make them understand. And after a while, I stopped trying. I just avoided it altogether. So I threw myself into work instead. I worked in social care and addiction. I became a business manager for a very successful residential unit. I was good at it. I was capable and driven and present. And it filled the hours. It filled a great many hours. And through all of it, the secret sat there, patient, waiting. But I haven't told you about the other thing that happened, the thing I think about, even now. While I was at the social services office that first time, I had discovered that there was a register where birth parents looking for their children could add their name, and children looking for their parents could add theirs, and the office would see if a match came up. I added my name, more out of desperation than hope, I think. I wanted answers. I wanted to know what had happened, whether there had been an assault, whether it had been something else, what had led to that, and why. Always, underneath everything, why. Some months later, a match came up. The office rang to ask if I still wanted to go ahead and meet my mother. I said yes, of course I said yes. I was given an address, again in secret, again alone. I made my way there and knocked on the door. A woman answered, and I was completely unprepared for what I felt in that moment, because for the first time in my entire life, I was looking at somebody who looked like me, and I looked like her. I had never had that, not once in 30-odd years. You might not think about that if you've always had it, if you've always had a face in your family that mirrors your own. But if you've never had it, the absence is enormous. And suddenly there it was, a face that was mine. She showed me into the flat. There was a gentleman sitting in the corner. She introduced him as a friend. And I looked at him, and I had that same recognition, that same absolute likeness. I am very certain to this day that that was my father. We were all in a room together, and I looked like everybody. But then the questions started coming out of me. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't realized how much had been stored up, how much pressure had been building for years. I started firing questions, fast, one after another, not waiting for answers. And she was distant, cooler than I had expected. I had imagined warmth. She had put her name on the register, hadn't she? She must have wanted to see me, but she seemed held back, reserved. And the more distant she seemed, the faster the questions came. She stopped me eventually. She said, "Look, you're clearly upset. You're clearly distressed. Why don't we rearrange this? Go away, write down everything you want to ask me, and then come back calmer, and I'll try to answer your questions properly." I felt embarrassed. But she was right. I wasn't getting anywhere. So I took the phone number she offered, and we agreed I would call in a couple of weeks. I went home. I wrote down every question I had ever wanted to ask, pages of them. Why did it happen? Why did she leave? Why did she not try to find me? Why now? I rang the number. The line was dead. I rang the operator. She confirmed the line had been disconnected. So I went back to the flat. No answer. I knocked on neighbours' doors. Nobody knew them. It was rental accommodation, come and go, no forwarding address, no trace. They were gone. I cannot fully describe what that felt like. Being rejected once is devastating enough. There is a particular quality of pain in being left by someone before you even knew them, but being rejected twice by the same person, when you had been given the promise of answers and then had that promise dissolved without explanation, that is something else entirely. That cuts in a different way, deeper, more confusing, because it raises more questions than it answers. Why did she put her name on the register if she didn't intend to follow through? Why let me find her at all? I don't know. I will probably never know. I came to a kind of uneasy peace with the idea that perhaps she simply wanted to see that I was all right, that the decision had been the right one, but it felt like abandonment. It felt like being told, you matter enough to be checked on, but not enough to be kept. And I locked the whole thing away. I put it in boxes in my mind, and I sealed them, and I just got on with living. I never thought I would tell anyone. I genuinely believed I would carry this to my grave. I don't know exactly why it came out when it did. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't intended it. I had had yet another operation. I have a number of health conditions, some genetic, some not, and I couldn't drive, so a very dear friend of mine was taking me home from work. He was also the director of the addiction clinic we ran together. We were talking generally about adoption, about children, just conversation, and something came loose. Out it tumbled, all of it. I started talking, and I could not stop. 20 years of sealed boxes opening all at once. I was in floods of tears, shaking, waiting for the reaction I had always known would come, the disgust, the withdrawal, the moment he pulled away. Instead, he said, "How could you think that people wouldn't want to know you because of your background? That has nothing to do with you. You are not defined by that. You are who you are. Capable, personable, well-liked. Why have you carried this for so long?" By that point, I was in my early 40s. I had been carrying this for 20 years. At first, I didn't believe him. I thought he was just being kind, just trying to make me feel better. And we kept talking. And it became clear that he meant every word, that he genuinely did not see anything in what I had told him that reflected on me, that my parents' choices, made in whatever circumstances they were made, had nothing to do with who I was. that I was not the person who had committed anything, that even the medical fears I had carried for so long, the certainty that my children would have been damaged, were based on things that simply weren't true, that I wouldn't necessarily have had a child with any difficulties at all. 20 years. 20 years of wrong information. 20 years of a life shaped by a fear that was never based in fact. I want you to feel that. The relief of it, yes, but also the grief of it, because relief and grief can live right beside each other, and they did that day in that car. I decided eventually to tell my parents, my adoptive parents. I went down to London, sat them down, told them everything. When I finished, they were distraught, not because of what I had told them, not because they judged me or thought anything less of me, but because I had felt it necessary to carry that secret alone for so many years, because I hadn't come to them. They told me, "You are our daughter," where you came from, how you came to be. None of that was ever a consideration. We chose you. We have always chosen you. I sat there and I thought of all the years I had believed the opposite. I told my siblings next. Same reaction, then friends, then more people, and every single time the reaction was the same. What are you worried about? You are Teresa. That's who we know. That's who we love. And then a journalist friend said something to me that changed everything again. She said, "Do you have any idea how many people you could help if you shared this story?" She said there would be countless others. People sitting exactly where I had sat, carrying exactly what I had carried, convinced they were the only one. Because nobody talks about this. Nobody thinks there is anyone else in the same situation. So I told my story, in print, in a national newspaper. The response was extraordinary. Hundreds of people. Messages, comments, letters through the paper. People in exactly the same situation. People who, like me, had been silently shaping their entire lives around a secret, around a shame, around a fear, and who thought they were entirely alone. They were not alone. You are not alone. I will not stop telling this story, because every time I tell it, someone somewhere realizes they can put down what they have been carrying. And I would not wish upon anyone the decision I made at 21 on a pavement in North London, a decision made in blind ignorance, in complete isolation, that cost me 20 years of a life I could have been living differently. I felt sick, I felt revulsion, I felt that no one would ever want to know me. And I was wrong. I was so completely, profoundly wrong. And if you are sitting with a secret right now, if you are walking those same pavements, carrying those same boxes, I want you to hear this. You are not what happened to you. You are not what was done before you existed. You are not defined by the choices of people you never knew. You are only, ever, yourself. And that is more than enough.